In this presentation, we'll provide an overview of the project, key discussion points, and decisions, along with sample transformation output. I'll cover the project overview, introduction, reasoning behind the project roster, project phase 1 scope and timeline, deliverables, and workflow. For more information about the project, please visit our project GitHub repository. The project was initiated in 2021 by the linked data team of the Cataloging and Metadata Services Department at the University of Washington Libraries, designed to create a robust mapping from the MARC21 bibliographic format to RDA, RDF, along with the corresponding data conversion tool. The project aims to demonstrate that RDA data can be represented most accurately using the RDA ontology and to show how well LRM, RDA, RDF supports the user tasks. Authority data is beyond the scope of this mapping. Our reasoning behind the project is as follows. MARC is a record-based descriptive format and is not well suited for entity-based descriptions. It consolidates everything into a single record and relies heavily on text strings. Modern metadata employs an entity-based approach, defining entities such as persons, corporate bodies, places, works, expressions, concepts, etc. This approach focuses on describing relationships between entities. RDA data can be represented most accurately using the RDA ontology. The project aims to make the transition from MARC to RDA more complete and sustained for the future. Our project roster is as follows. There are a lot of people from University of Washington Libraries, but we include a lot of contributors from outside of the University of Washington. Yragui, project manager, and Cypress Payne, transformation lead. The project on phase 1 focuses on MARC21 fields considered core in the PCC bibliographic standard record. It distinguishes between two groups of resources, prioritizing Group 1 resources. Group 1 resources include non-aggregates and augmentation aggregates. Group 2 resources include parallel aggregates and collection aggregates. Exclusions from phase 1 scope are diachronic works, Group 2 resources, and entity reconciliation or deduplication. The timeline for phase 1 extends to the end of 2024. The deliverables for project phase 1 are an official GitHub release of MARC to RDA project. The release will feature spreadsheets representing the mapping of MARC21 bibliographic data to LRM, RDA, RDF data, documentation to guide the use and interpretation of the mapping and transformation, XSLT style sheets containing the transformation code, sample data sets, and accompanying materials such as additional vocabularies and metadata properties published by the University of Washington Libraries. Our project phase 1 workflow is as follows. First, we created a MARC to RDA mapping file based on the RDA maps file, which relates RDA properties to MARC21 bibliographic encodings and is maintained by the RDA MARC21 alignment task force within the RSC technical working group. After completing our first mappings together, during the weekly meeting, members identified and selected a MARC field to map and carried out the MARC to RDA mapping in Google Sheets. This Google Sheets shows the MARC to RDA mapping for the 650 subject heading field. Once a member completes the mappings for the field, another member reviews them and marks them as done. We spend most of our weekly meetings discussing issues related to mappings and making decisions, sometimes through voting if we couldn't reach a consensus. Our decisions are recorded in a decisions index. Then the completed mappings are coded in XSLT. The last but not least step is running the code on test files, which are LC bibliographic records. Thank you.
Thanks, Junghae. I'm going to go over some of the big decisions we've made during phase 1, including our approaches to aggregates, reproductions, subjects, related entities, unconstrained RDA properties, and choosing Wikibase Cloud as a prototype for our output data. Next slide, please. In RDA, an aggregate is a manifestation containing more than one expression. Our goals for this phase are to separate manifestations into 2 groups, which Junghae already described, and to mint entities for aggregates in group 1, which will honor RDA's data model. And accomplishing this using legacy MARC21 data was a pretty tall order. Next slide. We started by comprehensively assessing the MARC21 bibliographic standard and cataloging practices for aggregate and singleton expression manifestations in legacy data. From there, we recorded a list of reliable logical patterns that could be used to flag types of aggregates. This work was led by Deborah Fritz. The aggregate markers were written into transformation code, tested against a set of around 15,000 records, and evaluated by the rest of the team for accuracy before being adopted. We're only including singleton expression and augmentation aggregate manifestations in the phase 1 dataset, and we plan to include other aggregates in future phases. Next slide, please. Reproductions posed another challenge due to inconsistent cataloging practices. RDA treats manifestations for originals and reproductions as separate entities. Teasing out descriptive elements for distinct entities from a MARC record that does not consistently distinguish between the two was complex. Many MARC fields may contain information about a reproduction or original manifestation or both, depending on the context of a bibliographic record's creation. Next slide, please. We took several steps to address this issue. We started by assessing the MARC21 bibliographic standard and past and present cataloging practices associated with reproductions. Then we recorded conditions we could use to determine whether a MARC record describes a reproduction. Where reproduction conditions are met, we provided field-by-field alternative mappings throughout the MARC standard based on further contextual conditions to determine whether the metadata in the field describes the original manifestation, the reproduction, or both. This work has been led by Laura Ackerman and assisted by Doreen Chen. Based on these conditions, the transformation code mints appropriate entities for the manifestations and maps elements to their corresponding entities. Next slide, please. Representing MARC21 subject metadata as linked data has been a consistent challenge for library ontologies. It was particularly challenging for us because RDA lacks an entity type for concepts. We decided to reify concepts for subjects, classification numbers, and other similar concepts such as genre form terms as SCOS concepts. This work has been led by Gordon Dunsire and assisted by Penny Sun. Next slide, please. Here's a simplified version of what our data looks like for subjects. We're relating subjects to RDA works using the has subject element and minting a SCOS concept entity. Then we can say things about it, such as has preferred label and is in scheme. This solution has worked out nicely, and Cypress will show some examples later in the presentation. Next slide. A strength of RDA is in its emphasis on relationships. RDA RDF data explicitly expresses those relationships in the form of triples. For this to work, entities must be unambiguously identified. A MARC21 record describes work, expression, manifestation, and item entities for the resource it describes, or the WEMI stack, implicitly. It also describes relationships to other secondary entities, a lot more ambiguously than an RDF dataset would. 1XX, 7XX, and 8XX fields indicate relationships between the main WEMI stack or resource entities, with varying degrees of specificity. We wanted to fully express these relationships as far as we could using the relator terms, properties from subfield 4, and other contextual clues from the MARC records. Next slide, please. To figure out which resource entity should go into the subject position of a triple, which relationship ought to be used as the predicate, and what the object or value of a triple ought to be, our team put together a table. The table maps the relationship and entity indicators in MARC21 to RDA RDF. After we reviewed this table, we wrote code to traverse it. The code mints appropriate entities with the correct RDA relationships between them, according to input MARC21 bibliographic descriptions. Our test output demonstrated that this approach was effective for the majority of MARC21 data. However, some MARC data could not be mapped to specific RDA properties and needed to be mapped to less specific ones instead, or in some cases could not be mapped at all. Next slide. An example of this was the use of unconstrained RDA properties in legacy MARC21 data. We were unable to use these properties to determine which entities belonged in either the subject or object positions of our output triples, due to their unconstrained nature. Leaving them as they were would have left us with RDA data that was not well formed. Mapping from these properties over to constrained properties was impossible, because the data pointing in the direction of which entities belong in the subject or object positions of the triples was not present in the legacy data. As a result, we are not able to map unconstrained properties and strongly encourage practitioners not to use them. Next slide. As we began reviewing our initial output, we started thinking about how we wanted others to be able to interact with it at the end of our first phase, and started looking for an ideal place to park it when we were finished. We needed a place that would be open, accessible, and ideally editable by users. We knew that the National Library of Greece had used Wikibase Suite with success, but the University of Washington libraries lacked the resources to host and maintain a Suite instance of this scope locally. For scale, our initial transform output would be much larger than the current Wikidata triple store, roughly 250 to 500 million Wikibase items if we include the full dataset. Wikibase Cloud offered a lightweight, hosted solution that met all of our needs for holding an example subset of our data as a prototype. Next slide, please. One of our students, Yingsheng Wang, dedicated a directed fieldwork project this past academic quarter to setting up our Wikibase Cloud instance. We've worked with colleagues at Open Knowledge Greece to adapt code from the project that Sophia and Lazaro spoke about yesterday, to import the full RDA RDF ontology to Wikibase, and to import our RDA RDF triples. We're working closely with Wikimedia Deutschland to ensure that this process goes smoothly. The Wikibase instance will have a complete reproduction of the RDA ontology, a subset of our transformed dataset for testing and visual exploration, and have an accessible Sparkle endpoint. Now I'll turn it over to Cypress, who can talk in more detail about our output and transformation.
Thank you, Crystal. I'll now show some examples of transformation output. The input and output files being used in these examples are available in full and in multiple formats on our GitHub repository and at the URL shown on the screen. Next slide, please. MARC data is input into the transform as MARC XML and is output as RDA RDF XML data. Here, we are looking at a MARC record that was serialized as MARC XML and run through our XSLT transformation to produce RDA data, shown here in turtle format on the right. Next slide, please. Here we were looking at a record that includes a reproduction, indicated by the 533 field. Next slide, please. The transform outputs descriptions of both the original manifestation and the reproduction manifestation in RDA. Here we are looking at the original manifestation expressed in RDA. This is being shown in turtle format with labels instead of RDA property numbers to make it more readable, and we've added the MARC fields that the data has been extracted from. As an example, we can see that the 245 field resulted in a title proper and multiple statements of responsibility for this original manifestation. Next slide, please. Here's the reproduction manifestation from that same record. It has the same title information from 245, but also indicates that it is an electronic reproduction and pulls information from different MARC fields based on the mappings. Next slide, please. This is a continuation of the reproduction manifestation, and we can see how data was extracted from the 533 field here at the bottom, where we have a category of manifestation, date of manifestation, etc. Next slide, please. Crystal also discussed how we have implemented subjects. Here we are looking at subject fields in a MARC record, including some from LCSH and some from FAST. Next slide, please. In our RDA data, these fields are mapped to the work property has subject, and we can see here this relationship between the RDA work and the subjects which have been reified as concepts. Next slide, please. Here we can see what each of these concepts look like. The subject is minted as a concept with a scheme and a preferred label. Using the source and preferred label as a part of the minted IRI allows for some automatic deduplication of subjects across the transform data. Next slide, please. Finally, we can look at related entities. Here we have some persons and a corporate body related to the resource described in this record. The relationships are described in subfield E. Next slide, please. These are the same relationships using RDA properties, relating the agent to the resource's work and manifestation. Next slide, please. And here are the actual agent entities with a minted opaque IRI for the entity, as well as an access point based on the data available in the MARC record. Next slide, please. Thank you. I believe we now have time to answer some questions.
I see we had one question in the chat about the Wikibase. The Wikibase is still being set up by the student who is doing the academic project to set it up. So right now, only he and I have worked with it. But by the time it's set up, we anticipate that our entire project team will be working on it. And so far, it has been a good experience. And yeah, we haven't fully set it up yet. So
great. Yeah. Thanks for you took the question. Okay. Niklas has another question. Have you compared your results with BibFrame conversions from the same MARC sources?
You know, we began this project because we did a BibFrame conversion, an RDA, a BibFrame to RDA conversion before, and it didn't work out. BibFrame can't really be used to hold RDA descriptions in our experience. We haven't compared our results to BibFrame conversions directly, but we are confident that our records will be, that our description sets will be more accurate reflections of the RDA description standard.
Okay, thank you. That's one last question by Niklas. Could you discuss the decisions for reifying concepts and how fast fits? It's not from Niklas. Could you discuss the decisions for reifying concepts and how fast fits into the decision? Do you?
That might be a question. The better than I can.
It's also in the chat.
Yeah, I can answer that a little bit. The decision to reify concepts for subjects involved a lot of discussion amongst the group. And one of the decisions was whether we separate out different subfields into separate concepts, and such as how fast does it. And we eventually decided that we would like to maintain how fast separates out different portions of subjects, but we did not want to do the exact same thing for other subject sources such as LCSH.